Hi everyone, today is June 1st and I'm going to be doing a wrap-up of the books I read in the second half of May. I already did a wrap-up of the books that I read in the first half of May, and to be honest, I read a few less books in the second half of May, but there's a few reasons for that. First of all, I did my wrap-up for the first half of May almost 3 weeks into May, which wasn't great timing, so I think I've only finished a few books since then. I've also actually been spending a lot more time on videos the past few weeks, which has been really fun, and I think I'm getting faster at it, but that has definitely been really time-consuming. Also, to be fair, my reading has always had a lot of ebb and flow. There will be days where I read a book a day or read a lot for a few days and then take a few days off, so I think that's pretty normal for me. At my last wrap-up, I was partway through reading Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, and since then I finished. I posted a review of this pretty recently. Overall, I still really enjoyed Elantris, even after multiple rereadings, and I think that it has a lot of the hallmarks of his more mature style and a lot of the things that make his writing really great. In my review, I did point out a few issues in it. I think those are things that he's mostly addressed in his writing in more recent books, but they did stand out to me more when I was rereading Elantris, which was his first published book. The other reread that I did was The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. There were a few reasons that I felt like rereading this book. First of all, I had seen about half of the new HBO series in the fall when it was airing, and I actually quite enjoyed it, and I am hoping to finish that series at some point. I don't get to watch a lot of shows these days, but I did really like the first half of it, so I do want to finish it up. I thought they did a really good job bringing the series to life and also in combining material from throughout the 3 books into one chronological narrative that really worked. The other reason that I wanted to reread The Golden Compass was that I read the first book in his prequel-sequel trilogy last year, and I really liked it, and I actually didn't like The Golden Compass or its sequels when they were first coming out and when they were popular. It wasn't a series that I was a big fan of, even though it was very, very popular when I was in middle school. But reading that more recent book by him and finding things in it that I really appreciated made me think that maybe I would appreciate The Golden Compass now more than I did when I was younger. And I also remembered hearing that it was a book that was marketed towards children and young adults, but that he hadn't written for any specific age range. So I was just really curious what I was going to think of the book rereading it. At the time, I think I liked The Golden Compass okay, and then the other 2 books in the trilogy I didn't care for that much. I did learn one really interesting fact when I was doing some reading online about the book. So I knew that The Golden Compass was the US title of the book, and it was also the title of that really not very good movie adaptation that they made, I think it was around 10 years ago. I don't really remember. It was pretty bad. I went to it with a friend and we sat in the back and kind of made fun of it. But anyway, the title of the book in the UK has always been Northern Lights, and I assumed that that title change was more of a Harry Potter type situation, where Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone got sold and marketed as Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone in the United States. And apparently that was because the American publisher didn't think that American kids were going to pick up a book that had the word philosopher in a title. Or more charitably, they said they wanted a title that really made it clear that that was a book about magic, and so they changed the word philosopher to sorcerer, even though the Philosopher's Stone is actually kind of a thing in mythology and folklore, and there is no such thing as the Sorcerer's Stone. I mean, there's probably no such thing as the Philosopher's Stone either, but at least it's an idea that existed. Anyway, that isn't exactly what happened with the title of The Golden Compass. It actually turns out that The Golden Compasses was the original title of the trilogy. You might know that the trilogy is kind of Pullman's retelling of Paradise Lost, and the title of the series, which is his Dark Materials, is pulled from Paradise Lost. And so The Golden Compasses is another phrase from Paradise Lost that he was originally planning to use as the title. But when he changed his mind, apparently the American publisher had gotten so attached to the title The Golden Compasses that they asked him if they could market the first book as The Golden Compass in the US. The other thing that's really interesting about that is that as a reader, I assumed that the Golden Compass was referring to the device in the book that's golden that sort of could be like a compass, but apparently it doesn't have anything to do with that at all. The compasses that are being referred to in the Milton quote are drafting compasses, like what you use to draw a circle in math class at school. So I think the publisher might have had the same misunderstanding. But anyway, I thought that was a really interesting story. Now that I've reread The Golden Compass, I have to say that I don't really feel like this is a book that's aimed at kids. I know it was marketed heavily towards kids and then young adults, but even though it has a child protagonist, there's something very adult about the concepts behind it. Even though the protagonist, Lyra, is a kid, I think she's about 10 or 11 in the first book, she is seen through the perspective of a kind of omniscient narrator. And in my experience, especially modern books for kids or young adults are more targeted to show things from the point of view of that age range. And we don't really feel that way at all. We do get to know Lyra, but we don't really see through her eyes. We see her through the eyes of the adult narrator and the adults around her. Reading it now, I understand why I wasn't able to get deeply invested in this book when I was Lyra's age. And just a quick spoiler warning here, if you haven't read The Golden Compass or know about it, just skip ahead maybe 30 seconds to a minute until I'm talking about something else. But I do just want to say, because I think it proves my point, that the climax of this book revolves around a discussion of the concept of original sin, and then there's a discussion of castration, both sort of mentioned in a physical sense, but also very more in-depth in a more spiritual sense, with kids getting cut from their demons. And then Lyra's father murders her best friend in front of her. And while he's not exactly a hero in this series, he's definitely, from what I remember, not exactly the villain. This is sort of a necessary act for the series. And given that the whole series kind of seems to be Pullman's views on religion and a retelling of Paradise Lost and his sort of own ideas about these things, I don't think it really is for kids. I mean, I read all sorts of things that weren't for kids when I was younger and it didn't hurt me. I don't think this is a book that kids should not read. I just don't think that even as a smart kid, I understood or appreciated most of what the books were about, I'm guessing. So now, all of those thoughts aside, as an adult, I still didn't love The Golden Compass, but I think I appreciated it a lot more for what it is and is intended to be, and it wasn't just a book that all my friends were reading that I couldn't really get into. I know that Pullman would probably hate this comparison because I think I've seen that he doesn't really like Narnia, but there was kind of a C.S. Lewis Narnia quality to the writing, even though he's coming from a more anti-religion perspective in some way. I feel like the way he uses the child character and the moral ideas of the story were kind of similar in tone from what I can remember. It's been many years since I read Narnia, of course. The next thing I read was Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennet. This is the sequel to Foundryside, which I read last year and really quite liked for a lot of reasons. I thought it had a good, interesting sort of Renaissance fantasy setting. There was a really well-developed magic system that he used very effectively in the plot, and I found that the characters were pretty engaging, and I came to care and get more interested in them over the course of Foundryside. However, Shorefall was kind of a disappointment. Whenever you get to the second book in a series, you're kind of waiting to see if it's going to live up to the promise of the first one or let it down, and in this case, it was kind of a letdown. First of all, it started out with a 3-year time skip. I had actually seen someone else's review mentioning that time skip, and if I hadn't, I would have been in the shoes of the person that did that review, who was totally confused and didn't catch on for ages that there was even a time skip, because it's just sort of thrown in there in the middle of an action scene, and it's kind of hard to understand what's going on. The biggest problem for me with the time skip is that the characters' relationships are all in really different places than they were at the end of the first book, but that development and growth is completely not supported by anything in the writing. It feels unearned. Romantic relationships that were just beginning feel really established. Friendships that didn't really even exist are now solid. And that's fine. It's not like the relationships were badly written, but normally in order to believe that the characters are at that point, you need to see something that leads it there. So that was one big problem. I just wonder if he needed to have that time skip in order to do the plot he wanted to do. Maybe there was another way to make it more smooth. One example of how this was done pretty well is in Kingdom of Copper, which is the sequel to City of Brass. There's a sort of substantial time skip there at the beginning, but the author does the work in the first couple of chapters to get the reader up to speed to what has happened since we last saw the characters. So other than the time skip, I honestly didn't enjoy the plot that much. It was pretty exciting, it kept me reading, but it had kind of the same problem I mentioned when I read A Conjuring of Light in the Shades of Magic series, where there's this all-powerful villain that comes in and just flattens everything, seems completely unbeatable. But as the reader, you know there's no way that they won't somehow defeat this villain. And yeah, maybe there'll be a price, but the fact that he seems so unbeatable just actually makes the stakes feel very low, because it doesn't feel like a close thing at all. It feels like they're just getting stomped for most of the book, but you know there's got to be some way they're going to figure it out, so you're just kind of waiting for them to get there. The other issue I had with the book was that there were so many flashback scenes. There were way too many flashback scenes, and I love a good melodramatic flashback scene sometimes, but there was just way too much of the plot that came in through that, and it got used in a way that wasn't the greatest. And I think usually flashback scenes like that are signs that the author is just a little bit too in love with what they're doing, and they needed to pull back, tone it down a little bit, and find something that would connect with the reader a little bit better. Flashback scenes are never as good for the reader as they are for the writer. So even though I didn't really like Shorefall, I still think Foundry Side was good, and I will definitely still read the next book. I'm not feeling that invested in the characters anymore after the second book, but even so, I do want to see how this all wraps up. There's one more book I want to talk about. I am not quite done with it. I'm listening to The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu on audiobook. It's a pretty long book. The audiobook is about 20 hours long, and I'm within a couple hours of the end. I should finish it soon, so I think it's worth talking about it now. This is a book that I was sort of turned off by when I started listening to it, but I've actually come to really appreciate it now that I'm about 17 hours in, and I'm really glad that I kept going. The feel of reading it is a cross between reading something modern and reading some sort of historical epic. And for me, at first, I felt like if I wanted to read an epic in that style, I might as well just go read a classic, like The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I'm not familiar enough with Chinese history to catch all the allusions, but from looking up this book and what I've seen about it, it's basically a retelling of the history of the Han Dynasty in a fantasy setting. This book was marketed as silkpunk, which basically just means that there are airships and clockwork and some of the things that you might expect to see in steampunk. What I liked about this book was that it was very influenced by China and Chinese history and was strongly Chinese in a way, but it wasn't a literal translation of China onto a fantasy world the way that you would see in something like The Poppy War, or even in the historical fantasy books that Guy Gavriel Kay has done. It was just a fantasy that was based on and inspired by China and Chinese lore in the same way that a lot of traditional fantasy is based on Europe. The book kind of has a cast of thousands. There are two main points of view, but then there are other characters that you only get their point of view for maybe a chapter or two, and it really covers all sorts of sweeping political history. I don't normally enjoy books where you don't get to know the characters that intimately because of the scope of the work, unless it's a classic, but for me, this book really captured that feeling of reading a classic or a historical epic. Once I realized what the experience was going to be and just kind of accepted that and committed to it, I really got immersed in it. There's a lot of discussion of the meaning of power and nobility, and characters looking at what it means to be noble versus of common birth, or looking at noble ideals of the past versus the future. Also things about the role of women and the effect that war has on society. It's not a totally serious book, but those are the themes that I saw getting explored in it. And it really does have the feeling of reading some sort of epic that could have been written 1,000 years ago, but with some modern twist and updates. There actually isn't very much magic in this book. There's a little bit, but mostly it comes through in that there's a whole pantheon of scheming gods that are constantly arguing with each other and interfering in the realm of mortals. This might not be for everyone, but I grew up loving Greek mythology, and this feels very similar, where the gods have their favorites and they show up in disguise, and there are prophecies and dreams, and they're just generally meddling. So if that sounds appealing to you, then you might enjoy this. Also, whether you know Han Dynasty history or not, this book is pretty obvious about where it's heading. You can kind of tell how things are going to work out in the end. It's just about kind of enjoying the journey of how you get there. But even though I didn't really know much about Han Dynasty history before reading this, now that I'm finishing, I'm really curious to look up a lot about it and see how much was taken from history and to see how things correlate. So that's just proof that sometimes reading fiction is actually a really good way to learn history. So that's what I read since the middle of May, and I think it was a pretty good idea to cut the wrap up in half for the month, since I ended up apparently having a lot to say about what I read in the last couple weeks. But let me know what you think. Would it be better if I did the whole wrap up at the end of the month instead of splitting it halfway through, or was it better this way? Thanks so much for watching, and please hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me.